I made a comment in July that EDH has effectively become the casual way to play paper Magic. And it really has. The days of 60-card kitchen table gaming are in the past, replaced by a diverging path for newer players. Either play Arena and get your 1v1 fix from the comfort of your couch, or meet up with 3 other people and play Commander. The nostalgic part of me certainly wants to push back on this, and I've spoken before about some of the reasons why Commander perhaps isn't the best on-ramp for newer players. But there are also some clear upsides to Commander. The fact that it's a casual format by designation rather than being casual gameplay on the fringes of competitive formats means a much greater degree of stability than something like 60-card kitchen table Magic, a format whose current form basically vanishes off the face of the earth whenever the friends who want to play it with you stop wanting to play it. More importantly, Commander as a format clearly isn't going anywhere in the casual scene, so it's pointless to try and fight against it. That said, the collapse of 60-card casual Magic, along with the slow decline in popularity of Draft that I've noticed over the last 10 years, have had me thinking, what are we losing exactly? What impact is it having that there is a growing population of Commander players who have played little to none of other formats? To be clear, this isn't intended as old man grumbling. I can certainly get old man grumbly sometimes, as somebody who has been playing Magic for more than half of my life, and maybe I'd be more old man grumbly if I were a modern player or something. But no, this is a genuine question, and to get some insight into it, I'm going to answer a slightly different set of questions in this video. What does the experience of playing formats that aren't Commander endow upon a player? What impact might that sort of experience have on the way they play Commander? And do these impacts make it worth venturing outside EDH from time to time, for us primarily EDH players? To start with, let's talk about the gameplay experience of a 20 health 1v1 format. A defining feature of these formats, as compared to Commander, is that they're low slung and grindy, with smaller threats being more relevant. With this fact in mind, what I'm about to say may initially seem a bit confusing, that being that playing these formats can directly help with building the skills required for playing Commander. Commander and 20 health formats certainly are different, but counterintuitively this is exactly why it can be helpful to have played the latter. It can give a player breadth of experience. See, playing Commander gives players lots of experience in fighting against big, bombastic win cons. For starters, you've got the obvious examples, like combo decks and combo-adjacent plays like a Massive Expel or a Craterhoof on a board full of tokens. Plays that reduce 1 or more life totals to 0 in one fell swoop, and often do so with large excesses of damage. Even outside of these, life total can frequently feel irrelevant in EDH, regardless of whether it is or not. Even with a conventional big creatures midrange deck without a splashy singular finisher, a lot of times most damage will be dealt in 1 or 2 attack swings. This comes down to the snowball-y nature of a lot of EDH decks. All sorts of cards are intended to push a deck to greater and greater volumes of gameplay, whether that be effect doublers or mana doublers or other forms of action compounding engines. This often means that decks buckle down until they have a massive board of creatures to attack with before swinging wide, sometimes for entire life totals in one go. Somebody might have to count out 35 damage to this player, 29 damage to that player, and so on, and under that context, opponents don't even really need to think about their life total, regardless of if a handful of points of difference would have been relevant or not. Like, come on, you lost because the opponent popped off, simple as. However, what this means is that Commander players are often less prepared for grindier games where every point of life total matters. The results of this can be seen when it comes to blocking and life total management. Players who are more experienced in formats where life totals are relevant will be much more careful of certain life total thresholds, and more willing to block to stay above them. Players of 20 health formats learn to internalize the idea that life total is a resource, and to know when to spend and when to save that resource. But Commander players who have spent a lot of time dealing with bigger 1 or 2 shot win cons won't internalize this lesson nearly as quickly. EDH's higher life totals also train players to mostly disregard the idea of blocking with useful creatures, because it feels better to keep them around, and most of the time, that's the correct decision in terms of strategy as well. Unlike in a 20 health format, where blocking with a key creature to stay alive for an extra turn or two is a very common necessity that players get used to biting the bullet on, this isn't necessary nearly as often in EDH due to higher life totals and heftier win cons, and this means that when it becomes a necessity, a lot of players instinctually refuse to do it, even when it means sacrificing an amount of life that will almost certainly lose them a game. Another aspect of non-Commander gameplay, and particularly limited formats, is low resource environments, where players are top-decking or working under tight constraints in some other way. These games aren't wildly common in Commander due to how common ramp and draw are, with variation by playgroup obviously, and this means that you need to play a lot more EDH to get comfortable under these circumstances than you would to get comfortable under more common EDH scenarios. The results of this can be quite problematic. When a game has involved some form of stacks or heavy attrition and resources are dwindling, you can usually tell who has played other formats and who hasn't. A lot of primarily EDH players will be looking at the situation as a lost cause, a game gone wildly off the rails, whereas players who have done their time in the trenches of limited or 60-card formats will be more engaged and vigilant, looking for outs and bits of incremental advantage to grab onto. Outside of gameplay, the experience of building 60-card decks can help with EDH deck building as well. One way this can manifest is when building decks that are exceptions to traditional norms of EDH deck building. See, people tend to have rough templates they follow when they build commander decks, myself included. A low double-digit number of draw spells is good for maintaining a consistent stream of cards turn over turn, maybe more if those draw spells are smaller, or less if the deck has other ways to compound value, or tutors to find its value engines. Likewise, a low double digits amount of ramp will be good for a deck that wants to have a single piece of ramp most games, but is fine occasionally not having one, and adjustments can be made up or down depending on how often a deck wants ramp, what size of ramp a deck wants, and how aggressively a player is willing to mulligan. These are references I follow, and I like them as a starting point because they're flexible. They prescribe numbers of cards based on what a deck wants to do and what other tools a deck has available to it. However, the trouble comes when references like these are less flexible and when they're treated as gospel regardless of what deck they're being applied to. Ramp is a great example for demonstrating this because it's one of the biggest differences between EDH and other formats. Basically, all EDH decks have some amount of ramp in them, and most have a decent amount. 8 to 10 slots spent on ramp is common. By contrast, most 60-card decks do not. You will get specific decks focused on high-cost plays, such as Tron, that focus a lot of deck space on ramping, and you'll get mid-range decks that run a spattering of efficient dorks to hit their impactful 3, 4, and 5 drops a turn early in some games in order to gain a tempo advantage. Broadly, though, ramp isn't widely played in 60-card formats because it often isn't worthwhile to expend a card just for a bit of acceleration. This is likewise true in limited. I'll run an efficient dork like a Llanowar Elves, and I'll run a card like Dance of the Tumbleweeds or Poison Dart Frog that has some extra utility attached at a good rate, and occasionally I'll add some lesser ramp if I have critical high-cost plays that my game plan ended up needing to revolve around. Aside from these instances, though, it's almost never correct to play ramp in draft or sealed. Draw is usually sparse, and mana and cards are better spent contesting the board and threatening life totals. The result of all of this is that in formats outside Commander, ramp spells are viewed very critically. A player must ask themselves, why is this here? And if that question doesn't have a clear and persuasive answer, the card will generally get cut. By contrast, many people building a commander deck will throw together their template-built EDH deck with the requisite count of ramp cards picked from among the available staples. These will often be added without consideration for what the cards are accomplishing. You'll get Cultivate in 2-color decks with a 4-mana commander, Gilded Lotus in decks with an average mana value of 2.5, Rampant Growth in an artifact-centered deck with a 3-mana commander, and so on. Fundamentally, the issue is that a lot of players don't stop to consider what ramp is offering them, because they're playing in a format where it is an unquestionable fact of life. I play ramp because I want more mana. Come on. Now, in most decks, this won't be the end of the world. Decks do want ramp spells, and even if players add ramp that is a bit suboptimal for their deck is still spending slots on a thing that it needs, and the specifics can be corrected later. However, just as there's variety in how much ramp 60-card decks want, there will be some commander decks that don't really want ramp in any sort of conventional quantities. I have 2 different decks where this is the case. In both my Malfegor deck and my Francisco Malcolm deck, I don't want to spend the entirety of my turn 2 or 3 playing ramp spells because I have more useful cards I want to be developing. Both decks include a handful of rocks for purposes of weaving into a later turn, because this is still EDH we're talking about, and getting a future mana boost off of a 1-mana investment is still useful for keeping up in later turns. But these aren't really a key card type, and each deck only runs a low single-digits quantity of 2-mana rocks so as not to draw more than 1 in the early stages of a game, plus a Soul Ring to cash in on my Wizards of the Coast mandated dose of variance. The step of asking how much mana a deck actually needs and what times it will want to play ramp spells is one that a lot of players forget to complete, and playing other formats where the inclusion of ramp isn't such a foregone conclusion is great for getting perspective on what these cards are actually accomplishing in a deck. The same can go for other card types. When is it correct to exclude or go light on card draw? When is it correct to exclude board wipes? These are things that EDH players will consider necessities, but depending on the deck, they might not be nearly as important as a player might assume. One other deck building skill that EDH isn't great at teaching players is figuring out optimal card quantities. A feature of singleton formats is that they restrict how many of a particular sort of card a player can run. Some cards will have many similar options, but other types of card will be more unique, and a player will have no choice but to add the number of it that exists to their deck and no more, regardless of how much they like it. This outsources a lot of decision making to the nature of the format. Players don't get to choose how many cards to add to their deck that create additional dragons when a dragon attacks. That decision is already made for them. Whereas in 60-card formats, up to 4 of a given card can be run, giving players room to flex counts up and down on various cards and see how they feel. In EDH, there often isn't this same level of choice. The result of this is that when players have access to a greater number of a particularly appealing effect, if they've played EDH but not other formats, the instinct might be to load up on all available copies of that effect, regardless of how many would actually be optimal for the deck. This is likely something that will be figured out in due time, so long as players are willing to challenge their assumptions about how their decks work from time to time, but having less of an intuitive sense on how many copies of a card is appropriate is certainly something that can lead to wasted time and games played with an off-kilter deck. Long story short, yes, playing formats outside EDH can imbue players with important experiences that will be especially useful on the fringes of the Commander experience. Commander players will have no trouble getting used to playing against snowbally value piles, dealing with board wipes, building conventional synergy-based mid-range, developing a growing knowledge of common staples, and so on. Playing lots of Commander will make you better at a lot of things in Commander, and playing enough Commander in diverse environments will even grant a degree of proficiency in the things I mentioned earlier: life total management, low-resource environments, unconventional deck types, and so on. These certainly aren't forbidden knowledge or anything, but playing formats outside EDH will help to instill certain lessons faster than others, and develop an intuitive sense for why they're true. It's also good to play other formats because cards are designed for other formats, and the further back in time a card was printed, the more it was focused for 1v1 formats. As much as it can feel like Commander players are playing in our own little bubble, we're playing with cards that are part of a broader game, and having a better understanding of all the facets of that game will help you as a player across the board. If nothing else, it's good to be aware of the areas of play that we might be a bit weaker in, and try to gain experience in them. To wrap this up, what formats should you be playing? As far as 60-card formats go, I can't really speak for the quality of most of them because I simply haven't played them recently, with one exception: Pauper. This all-commons format is cheap to get into and pretty vibrant, and its fast-paced but not overly complex gameplay makes it a great place to dive into 60-card Magic. Switching gears to Limited, my personal favorite way to play Magic outside EDH is Draft and Cube. The process of drafting from packs and deck building with the resulting pool is a skill-testing task all on its own that will appeal to anybody who loves deck building and also has a bit of a competitive or spike-adjacent streak. If those two options sound too intimidating, if nothing else, you should go to pre-releases. These are sealed events. You open 6 packs and build a deck with them. I personally prefer draft to sealed, but the exact reasons that make a long-time player like me have this preference make sealed a great option for players without as much experience playing Limited. Deck building is more streamlined and less punishing of mistakes, since decks can be totally rebuilt between rounds if it becomes clear something went wrong, and variance plays a greater role in success, which means that a less experienced player who pulls the right selection of cards can have a fighting chance even against a Magic veteran. If you want to hear more about why it's worth playing non-Commander formats and what formats you should get into, there's a whole episode that just released on the podcast I co-host that goes into more depth on this, and a link to that is in the description. With that said, thanks for watching, and thanks to Architect for supporting the channel. One of my favorite parts about the site is the visually streamlined folder system that lets me keep my decks organized with ease. A link to my Architect profile is in the description if you want to browse the various folders there and the decks contained within. As always, I also want to thank my patrons, some of whom are on screen now. My final deck review for the year is taking submissions now, so if you want a chance at getting selected for that, you can sign up for my Patreon for $3 a month. You'd also be receiving access to my back catalog of bonus videos, which spans back a year and covers a variety of topics. Alright, bye now.